Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Great Women in Compliance with Hemma Lomax and Lisa Fine, hosted by the Compliance Podcast Network and sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights. I am Hemma Lomax and I am so happy to welcome our guest today, my friend and mentor, Katharine Manning. Katharine is an expert on trauma-informed leadership and a leading voice on empathy. She is the president of Blackbird, a training and consultancy practice, and the author of the best-selling book, The Empathetic Workplace, 5 Steps to a Compassionate, Calm, and Confident Response to Trauma on the Job. Welcome, Katharine. We're so happy to have you join us today.
I am so happy to be here. I can't believe you said I was your mentor. I feel like you're my mentor.
Well, we always leave each other smiles. We arrive. I'm just so grateful that you're willing to come and share it with our listeners today. Many of our listeners will know you, but I would love you just to take a quick moment to introduce yourself and tell us who you are.
Absolutely. So I am a lawyer, but a lawyer who for most of my career has worked with victims of crime. I started off doing hotline work back in college. I did domestic violence, rape crisis work, and it was that work that really pushed me to go to law school because I felt like the legal system was not really doing enough to protect the most vulnerable. And after law school, first I went to a large firm for a few years, and then I went to the Justice Department, and I spent 15 years there as a senior attorney advisor on victims' rights. I was at the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys, which is a not very well-known part of DOJ, but if there are DOJ folks in the audience, they might know it. And my role there was really to be the legal expert on victim issues and cases. And it was the full gamut of cases, anything from terrorism to large-scale financial fraud, human trafficking, crimes in Indian country. And over the 15 years that I was doing that work, a few things started to become clear to me. One was that people didn't need different things based on what they were a victim of. Like it wasn't like the way we would support a victim of identity theft was all that different than the way we would treat a victim of terrorism. Everybody needed to feel heard. Everybody needed information about what was happening. Everybody needed some help, resources, referrals to get on their feet again. It turns out that when we are experiencing trauma, we tend to need the same things. Even though everybody's story of trauma is obviously uniquely their own, the ways that we support people in trauma are pretty similar. And I learned that in the work that we were doing with victims. And then I started to realize that it wasn't just the victims in our cases who needed those things. It was all of us too. It was my colleagues. It was my boss, sometimes for reasons that were work-related, like dealing with a really difficult case or matter. And sometimes because we're human and human things are going to happen. Somebody's gets very sick or their kid is struggling. And these issues, as much as we always want to feel 100% and on our game and completely professional in the workplace, the reality is trauma is not a jacket that you can just take off and hang up because now it's time to go to work. We carry it with us all the time and it affects us. It affects us in our home lives. It affects our mental and physical health. It affects our relationships and it affects us at work. And so I started really thinking a little bit more about those issues. How do we build workplaces that are more supportive, compassionate, empathetic, particularly for people who are going through challenging times? I left DOJ in 2019, and since then I've had my own company where I do this work. I do a lot of training and consulting on these topics. And as you mentioned, my book, The Empathetic Workplace, came out in 2021. So it's been really such a privilege to get to do this work, and in particular to see such a wide array of organizations, everything from very small nonprofits that are doing community health, all the way up to the Defense Department, to corporations, to colleges and universities, and to see in each of those environments leaders who are trying to figure out how to better show up for their teams, for their colleagues, for themselves when it matters most.
Catherine, I just love hearing this origin story of yours because I feel like it's your superhero origin story. Especially, you started in a context where it's high drama, high trauma for the participants, as you said, not just maybe the victims of the crimes, but also the first responders around, whether it's the court staff, the lawyers, the attorneys, the police officers, whoever it might be. But what strikes me is that you took that experience as motivation to find out what you could do to help. Is that right?
It is. And honestly, I feel so privileged to have had so many incredible teachers and models along the way. In particular, at the Justice Department, the victim advocates are just amazing.
Mm.
These men and women are incredible. They will spend all day with people going through the worst moments of their lives, and then will pass you in the hall and notice that you seem a little off and stop what they're in the middle of and give you their full attention. It's amazing to me the amount, like the depth of compassion that they have. And I just feel like I've learned so much from some just really incredible empathetic leaders along the way.
And I know that you've then taken those lessons and your own lessons of your experiences and brought them into your work to teach us what we can do in the workplace. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk about that. How does trauma show up in the workplace? Now, I'm going to assume that all the victims that you helped when you were at the DOJ, they turned up at work. They didn't take the jacket off after they left their cases or their issues. They had to show up with their families at work. So how does that impact the workplace?
Yeah, I think it's important, first of all, to understand just how common trauma is. Statistics show that about 70% of adults have experienced at least one trauma in their lives. And when they ask folks who are elders, people in their 80s, it's more like 90%. So I think
Wow.
we should assume if you work with people, you are working with people in trauma. There are going to be people experiencing trauma all the time. And just to clarify what I mean by the word trauma, because I know trauma is a word that has a lot of different definitions and a lot of different ways people use it. For my work, the definition of trauma that I use is that it's a psychological injury that impairs performance. This is a slimmed down version of the definition of trauma used by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. And what I like about the SAMHSA definition is that, in contrast to a lot of other definitions, it doesn't give you a listing of life events and say, if you've experienced one of these, then you've experienced trauma. I'm not crazy about that kind of definition because I think we can all have very different responses to similar or even the exact same event. If three people are in a car accident together, maybe one of them is a little shaken up at the scene, but able to check on others, engage with law enforcement, make their way into work, and they're okay. Maybe somebody else falls apart at the scene, can't go into work that day, can't get in a car for a week. Maybe a third one seems completely fine at the scene, goes into work, and then that night falls apart. None of those is the right or normal response. They're all just within the range of normal human reactions to a traumatic event. So I just feel like it's a waste of time, honestly, to spend too much time trying to understand what is it that you went through, and then I will tell you whether or not that's trauma. Particularly in the workplace, the focus should be on, do you need some help right now? Are you having trouble being able to perform in the ways that you need and want to? And if so, let's get you some support. So that's what I mean by trauma. And it really is all around us, certainly in recent years. I say sometimes it feels like trauma is just the air we've been breathing here in the
Mm-hmm.
2020s. It is like
Yeah.
all around us with COVID and political upheaval and environmental disasters and mass shootings and international violence. It's just been a really rough few years. But the fact is, we've always worked with people in trauma. Maybe we just haven't realized it, but just going to domestic violence, which is one of the first areas that I worked in, about 1 in 5 full-time employees will experience violence in their intimate relationship. So think about that, 1 in 5. I know it's so funny, Hemma, when I tell a lot of people that statistic, they're stunned by it and they say, how can it possibly be so high? But when I talk to the people who do domestic violence work, the researchers, the psychologists, and people who work in that field, they all say, could it be that low?
Mm-hmm.
It's probably even higher than that. And these issues do show up at work. So if we know about 1 in 5 people are experiencing violence in their home life or their intimate relationship, of those, 75% will be harassed by their abuser at work, because that's where they know how to find them. Even if you manage to move out, you get into a safer situation, that abuser still knows to find you at work. And so the abuse comes right into the workplace and, of course, results in absenteeism and turnover and all kinds of challenges with productivity and everything else you can imagine. So that's just one example. We are also, of course, working with survivors of sexual assault. We are working
Mhm.
with people who are dealing with mental and physical health challenges that may be visible or not to us. We're working with people struggling with addiction. We're working with people who are caring for loved ones who are dealing with all of those issues. So I think we just have to presume that the workplace has people who are experiencing trauma, and we should try to be trauma informed, which I know is another buzzword, right?
But it's
That
an
term.
important one. Yeah. Look, like you
Yeah.
said, you can't go in thinking you can fix these issues, but you certainly, if you inherit a community that may have these high percentages of trauma embedded, being trauma informed is going to help you, I'm assuming, be an empathetic leader. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And trauma informed just means you are aware that
Hmm.
trauma exists
Right.
in your team, in your workplace, and it's having a negative effect on people. And you try to not exacerbate it, hopefully mitigate it, and certainly try not to cause more of it. That's all that it means to be trauma informed. So I don't really think that it is different than most people's instincts. It's just how to do it in individual circumstances can be a little tricky.
Mhm. And you've mentioned a couple of the things we've gone through over the last 4 years, let's say, whether it's the Me Too movement, the race issues across the globe, COVID, work from home, and now a push to return to the office. All of these things can have exacerbating impacts on trauma. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And when you look at the levels of stress, anxiety, levels of engagement, which are just plummeting right now, I think we are seeing the toll of all of that. One of
Mhm.
the statistics that always stands out to me is there was a survey by Gallup that found that 18% of workers reported feeling angry or very angry on any given day. And I
Mhm.
think, wow, almost 1 in 5 workers are feeling angry every day. That's pretty shocking to me. I work from my home. I am my own boss. I don't go into an office every day, but I do see that anger. Certainly, I live in the DC area. Like,
Mhm.
certainly see it in traffic.
Yeah.
Uh, you see it at the grocery store, at the kids' school. You just see it's like everybody seems so short fused. It just takes a second to set them off these days. And I think it's the wear and tear of the last few years that we haven't had a chance to fully process what we went through, grieve what we lost, to really make sense of it all. It was, oh, now we've got the vaccines. Yay, everybody, let's go back to the office. Here's a cupcake. Woo. And it's, can we just take a beat? That was rough. That was really hard.
And Catherine, we've talked a bit about the trauma that might be brought into the workplace with the circumstances that you've experienced outside the workplace. I think also compliance and ethics professionals also deal a lot with trauma that seems to be created in the workplace. But as you're talking, I'm starting to think maybe it's all connected, right? Maybe a situation in the workplace is exacerbated by what's brought in, or maybe vice versa, right? Maybe the way you're treated at work can be brought home. So, how do you handle this idea of toxicity at work or harassment at work? What are the statistics there of what's happening at work?
Yeah, I think it is so essential that compliance officers, managers in general, have this understanding and really this tool in their toolkit, because it just gives you another lens to view things. Like the worker who has always been on time and then suddenly they are late, they are distracted, they are dropping the ball. Maybe there is something else going on. I remember speaking once to a CEO, and I was telling him a little bit about what I do and why it matters. And he got quiet for a second, and then he said, "We almost fired my best friend."
Mm.
And this was a guy who was the head of sales at the company. They had come up together, and he was really a pillar of the company, really essential to the success of the company. And then one day his performance just fell off a cliff. Like he was distracted, he was not showing up for things. He really was failing on multiple fronts. And the rest of the leadership team had a conversation about it, and they said, I think we're going to have to let him go because we can't have somebody in this really important role who can't carry the load. And then finally, one of them said, maybe we should talk to him and see what he has to say for
Mm-hmm.
himself.
Love that.
When they spoke to him, they found out that his wife was dying,
Mm-hmm.
that he was managing all of the doctor's appointments and the insurance and the grief and the trying to be an emotional support to her. And he didn't want to bring it up in the workplace because he thought, I don't want to be bringing my personal issues into work. And what is astonishing to me, according to this CEO, once they were able to have this conversation, his performance did a 180.
Wow.
Obviously, they put supports around him and they expressed their compassion, but even just being able to open up about what he was going through allowed him to remove a burden, because there's the burden of what he's going through at home and they can't do much about that. There's the burden of the work, which still has to get done, and you can maybe do some things about it, but ultimately it's still there. But then there's a third burden of what is work going to think about what I'm
Yes.
going through. And by removing that, they allowed him to focus more on those first two. And so that's how a trauma-informed response from a manager can really have such an impact on individual well-being and performance. And I mean, you're absolutely right. It almost doesn't matter what the cause of it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it can be things at home, it can be things in the workplace, but the more that supervisors are able to create an environment where people know that they can bring up the hard thing they're dealing with, the more quickly they will uncover issues that may be able to be dealt with. So if it is harassment or bias, which, I mean, certainly there is plenty of that. 38% of women have been sexually harassed at work. And just to throw a few more statistics at you, 27 teams with sexual harassment on them lose an average of $27,000 in productivity per team member. So not just the
Yeah.
harasser and the harassed, everybody on the team is losing productivity, which if you've ever been on a team with sexual harassment, you will know why. It's because everybody is saying, why didn't she go on that trip? And how come this person got this project instead of this one? And should I report something? Is there something going on? And what is not happening, as everybody's gossiping and worrying about that, is work. It drags down everybody's productivity. And bias, almost 40%, so 39% of workers report experiencing bias at work at least once a month. And those who are facing bias are 3 times more likely to be disengaged, 3 times more likely to be planning to quit, and 2.5 times as likely to withhold their own ideas and solutions at work. So you can see how these challenges in the workplace, right? So you have these sources of trauma, bias, harassment, as well as all the stuff that's going on at home, can be impacting the workplace, and how through creating a culture where people know that they are cared about, that they will be met with a compassionate response, and that the workforce actually is committed to supporting them through hard times, makes it more likely that these issues will be surfaced where they can be addressed and people can get the support that they need.
Yes, I think it's so important what you say about creating the conditions and the environment where these things can be addressed. Those statistics, honestly, Catherine, they're so overwhelming. And as you're saying that, I'm shaking my head. I'm like, I can't believe how high those numbers are. But the fact is, there are things we can control, right? No one's asking us to fix that. We're not mental health professionals. We're not doing therapy. We're just making sure we create an environment where people can be heard and seen. And it sounds like the gentleman you spoke about felt heard and seen, and that the people around him. And I love what you said. Somebody paused and said, hold on, what might be happening? What else could be true? And that made me think as you were speaking, there's judgment we can rush to, or we can pause and turn that into fascination. Hold on. That's odd. What could be happening? there was radical compassion in the story you explained, absolute compassion, rather than the judgment or the thinking of yourself. Why not think about what's changed? And I think it then ended with curiosity. Someone said, let's go actually ask and see if, what's going on and what we can do. And of course, it's up to the individual whether they want to share what's happening with them. But even just being asked and having that radical empathy, to your point, right? The empathy in the workplace can make a difference. So I know it's really easy for us as compliance officers to say, have empathy, be compassionate. But what I love about your work is you don't just say that, you give a tool. You mentioned tools, right? So what's your strategy for teaching someone like me to be able to actually do that in the workplace?
What the book is about, and a method that I have taught for a number of years now, is called the laser technique. And this is really, it honestly, Hemma, grew out of Me Too. When Me Too happened, I was on the one hand thrilled because I thought these are issues I've been thinking about and working on for so long, and I'm so glad we're having these conversations. But pretty quickly, I started to get frustrated with Me Too because I felt like Me Too put so much on survivors. Share your story. Everybody needs to hear your story. I was getting text messages from friends like, I've never told my story to anybody. Do I have to put it on Twitter, or I've let down the side? And I'm like, no, you don't owe your story to anybody.
Right.
And yeah, to underscore what you just said too, like it is up to each individual whether they want to share or not. But if they do choose to share, one of the things we have to ensure is that they are met with a compassionate and thoughtful response. That doesn't mean becoming their therapist. You should not be your colleague's therapist. Even if you are a therapist, you're not your colleague's therapist. But what this is, I really think of it as it's like the EMT skills. Like you're the one on the scene, you see what is happening, you provide some immediate support, and then you refer them on to the experts. But you never know who is going to be the one who's going to get that knock on the door or the phone call about, hey, do you have a minute? I need to tell you something. So the 5 steps, and I'll just go through it quickly, but obviously it's a lot more detail in the book if anybody wants to go deeper on it. But the 5 steps are: first, listen, which is active listening. It means you don't just sit there quietly and let them talk. You show them that you care. You create the circumstances that make it more comfortable for them to open up. So you give them your full attention. You nod. You encourage them to go on. You maybe ask a few questions, open-ended questions, to let them know that it's okay to continue. The second step is acknowledge, and that's where you show the person that you heard them. This is the step I think people are most likely to skip. And when a conversation seems to be going off the rails, it's usually because the person hasn't gotten enough acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is just showing them that you heard what they've said. You know that you did, but they don't always feel that until you do something to acknowledge them. There's this great quote I love, that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And in my work with victims, I saw it again and again. It was like talking to a wall. Like it would just bounce right back at you. Whatever you said, they couldn't hear it until they felt heard. So an acknowledgement is very simple. It's just something like, thank you for letting me know. Or that sounds hard or overwhelming or scary or whatever it sincerely sounds to you. Depending, I know that some of the compliance folks, this might be an uncomfortable one, but depending on the circumstances, you can say something like, I'm sorry for everything you've been going through. Obviously, that will depend on the context. And if you're a fact finder, you don't want to indicate a different kind of apology than you intend. You don't want to be offering up oh, I'm so sorry that we did that to you, when really you just
lawyers.
meant like, yeah, I know.
Getting in the way. No, I understand.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I know you thought about this too. You're an attorney, I'm an attorney. We can get away with saying this, but it is a shame sometimes when that gets in the way, because you can empathize without acknowledging guilt. You can be sorry that something's happened or sorry that they've experienced something without saying they have. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think often, why do people file lawsuits? It's usually for information or for acknowledgement. And if you can be more open and transparent from the beginning, often you can avoid a lot of litigation, which I know you and I have had have had many conversations
Right.
about.
The research runs deep on that. And one of the reasons we get on so well is both of us have come from this space of analysing victims' rights. I used to work for the United Nations and talking about victims' rights in the context of the International Criminal Court, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. My PhD is on victims' rights when it comes to war. And a lot of the research shows that just being given a space to be heard can heal a society. I mean, it's very, very powerful. Forget now the odd litigation here or there. It can really change and turn around a society if people are given the space, victims are given the space to make statements, to be heard on what happened. And often these situations, not all of them, of course, but often these situations do result in reconciliation and healing and moving forward. So, yeah, lots to be learned from that space.
Yeah. And one of the things that I find fascinating is the impact of being able to share your story to a person in a position of authority in
Yeah.
particular. This is something that I wish more people, particularly supervisors, higher ranked folks, understood. I think so often people who are in leadership positions feel like their job is to fix everything. And so when somebody comes to them with, I'm struggling, I'm experiencing whatever, the response is, how do I make that better? I have to fix that for you. But what is very clear in the research is that just being met with compassionate, active listening has the greatest impact on their healing. There was this phenomenal study where they looked at sexual assault survivors who shared their story with people who were in one of three categories. So, first, it was a friend or family member, second, a victim advocate, and third, a person in a position of authority, usually a police officer. They found the highest rates of healing in that third category, the people who shared their story with someone in a position of authority. And the conclusion was like, if I tell my story to my sister, like, she has to believe me. But if I tell my story to somebody that I see as an authority figure, and that person gives me the benefit of their time and attention, their care, well, that really means something. And so I think so often in the work environment, we want to jump to problem solving. And honestly, the most powerful thing you may do for that person is listening.
It's so important. Look, I will put my hand up. I am one of those people that jumps to want to fix. And I will probably come across as dismissive because I'm so quick to try and get to the fixing. And I hear you because it attacks both the L and the A of your laser. We'll get to the others. I want you to finish that. The listening, I'm not listening if I'm thinking about how to fix it. And I'm certainly probably running right past acknowledgement if I go straight into the fixing. Really important awareness, again, self-awareness and skills building. And as you said, we are the first responders many times, especially if we're in a position of authority. That can take many forms. You don't have to be a police officer or a superior. You can just be someone doing intake on an investigation. You might technically be a lower level when it comes to the corporate levels, but actually you're still the first responder and you represent the authority of the person that should be listening and
Such a
acknowledging.
great point. Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great point. It's relative authority on that particular matter. Really
Right.
great point.
Okay, I stopped you at the A.
Okay, so listen, acknowledge. The third step is share. And this is about sharing information that might be worthwhile for the person to know. One of the things I saw in my work with victims is everybody craved information. They wanted so much information. They wanted to know what happened, who knew what when, what was going to happen next. And it was almost insatiable. And I eventually realized that when we are going through a time of our lives where it feels like everything has been turned upside down, that's a really uncomfortable feeling because we want to feel in control of our lives. Everybody does. And so one way we can help them feel more in control is to share information, right? Knowledge is power. Or John F. Kennedy said, in times of turmoil and turbulence, it's more true than ever that knowledge is power. That's particularly when people want information. So the information to share can be any facts that you have that you know are accurate and are able to share. Those are great. If there's been a data breach or something like that, share as much information as you can, as quickly as you can about what information was accessed and how many accounts and anything we know. Just share what facts you have. But a lot of times, we either don't know the facts or we can't share them. But that doesn't mean that we can't share any information. There are other categories of information that we can share that are helpful. So the second category is process information. This is how investigations are conducted. This is how long they take. These are who the decision makers are. This is when you can expect updates. All of that is very useful information. The third category is values information. And these can be your organization's values or even your personal ones. So we take these issues very seriously, or I take these issues very seriously. That's actually helpful as well. And then finally, even being upfront about what you don't know or can't share can be helpful. So, as we conduct the investigation, we're going to be interviewing lots of people. It's important that everybody's recollection be their own and not colored by what they're hearing from others. So, we're not going to be able to share with you everything we learn over the course of the investigation. There will be a report at the end, or whatever is true, where you will learn more information then. And you are always welcome to ask me questions, and I will share what I'm able to share.
I really like that. And again, the lawyers come in and telling you what you should and shouldn't share. And I think it's really good to open your mind, and you can listen to those guidelines from your attorneys, but also find out what you can share. I've also found that explaining why you can't share things and acknowledging the frustration that might cause is also powerful. You may not be able to share a timeline. You may be able to say you're not sure right now when this will be concluded, but at least saying, I understand that can be frustrating and confusing, but we will keep you posted as much as we can. So I think there's lots you can do in that space. Very powerful.
Yeah, I think so too. And what you want to avoid is doing like a little sidestep. Like, I know they're going to ask me about X. I can't answer X. So instead, I'm going to talk about Y a whole lot and see if they get bored and walk away. Or I'm going to start avoiding phone calls so that I don't have to admit I don't have any update or that kind of thing. Just be upfront about we don't have anything else to share at this time, but I understand, as you said, I understand how frustrating this can be. Much better to be upfront about it than to try to obfuscate.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so we have got listen, acknowledge, and share. Where do we go next?
Empower. And
Empower.
empower is, I think, as important for us as the listeners as it is for the person who's experiencing the trauma, because a lot of us are fixers. You see somebody who is struggling and you just want to make it better. And this step reminds us that this is their path to walk and we can't walk it for them. So it doesn't mean we can't do anything. What we can do is give them a few tools to help them along the way. Now, the key is to make sure these are things they actually want. So a great place to start is, what do you need right now? Or how can I help you? And then try to give them that. So it might be that flexible work is what they need that would be most helpful. It might be mental health resources. It might be security options. I hope everybody kind of knows how to access those categories of things in their own organization. And if you don't know, go find out. Particular security, I would say, is one that can come up quickly. So if you don't know right now, if there were a security issue that came up at work, you don't know who you would call, go find it out and put it in your phone so that you don't have to go digging for it if an issue arises. Another great resource that I hope everybody knows about is our national, it's for both the United States and Canada, mental health crisis line is 988. So you can call or text 24 hours a day in English or Spanish to get trained mental health counselors there. So there are lots of great supports available. And these kinds of resources can make a huge difference in people's healing. The key, again, is just letting them decide when and whether and what to access. It's got to be in their control. So that's why the term is empower. You are empowering them. You're not taking over for them.
Katharine, I think about this one a lot. I told you I'm a bit guilty of being a fixer, so I do think about this when I think to myself, this agency, or you want to give people to make their own decisions and take their path without feeling bad that they didn't follow your advice. I think that's really important. And so I hear you saying, try not to give advice, give options, let them decide. There's also language I think we can use to make it clear that it's not advice. It's just resource, it's just options, and that we trust their judgment, and they should feel empowered to make decisions themselves, because I think it can be really off-putting if someone gives you advice, you didn't take their advice, you probably won't want to come back to them again.
Exactly. Yeah. What's some of the language you would use for that, Hemma?
So curious coaching questions can help as well. I wonder if you're looking for some support here, we can see what options there are for you. If and when you're ready to take care of that, come back to me, as opposed to saying, you should speak to this agency, you should read this pamphlet. Really trying to be more curious and having open questions about what might, to your point, what might help, instead of giving answers. I think, again, I've got lots of work to do here to practice this, but just becoming very aware of advice giving without that curiosity and that openness can really impact the connection going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great point. And I think you just made me think of a piece of advice I heard from a woman once. So she was a caseworker who would help women come out of prison with reentry, basically helping them. So she would meet with them to talk about their goals. I want to get a job. I want to get my kids back. I want to stay off drugs, whatever their goals were, and then would try to give them support in meeting their goals. And a lot of them were not able to meet their goals. And this woman started to get really demoralized and depressed. And she said what she had to do was really shift her thinking and realize that her role was to provide the resource and let go of the outcome.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
it. Don't become emotionally attached to the outcomes on behalf of the other people. And again, use your empathy. The empathy is maybe they're not willing, able right now, right? And that's okay. And
Mhm.
it could be not yet,
Yeah.
it could be never. You don't need to own that. You just need to support as
Exactly.
opposed to fix.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really
Yeah.
powerful. Okay, so we're at laser, we've got R.
Yes. So the last step is literally returning to the person
Aha,
to
there we
let them
go.
know you continue to be a support to them. Check in on them later, see if they need anything else. This is not a, hey, did you call that resource I told you about? But just, is there anything else you need? But also importantly, it's a return to ourselves because supporting others takes a toll on us too. And so we always have to be practicing good mental health hygiene ourselves if we want to continue to be our most successful selves.
Mhm, mhm. No, I'm so moved by that because you've told us how pervasive it is. I think if you want to help, you've got to think very carefully about what a real kindness is. So, really important. I did want to ask you a bit more about positional power because we talked a little bit about the role of the supervisor and culture building. So, what role does empathy at work have to play when it comes to culture building, especially for the people with positional power?
I think empathy is essential to trust, which is essential to psychological safety, which, for the record, is essential for physical safety. So, to me, all of those things are hand in hand. And so, we have to start with empathy, which to me, again, with my definitions, but I do think the terms are important. I think often people think empathy means I'm standing in your shoes or I have a complete understanding of your emotions or your feelings. And I just don't think that's realistic. I think what is more possible is I am striving to understand you, right? So I
Mm.
recognize the humanity in you and I'm striving to understand your experience and to support you. That's really all I mean by empathy. And if you can do that in the workplace, you create a work environment where people feel heard, they feel like they matter, they feel like it is okay to admit that they're struggling, they need some help, they maybe made a mistake or they don't know what to do. And all of those things enhance trust and psychological safety and can create the kind of work environment where people really are engaged and thriving, where we have just all of the good things come is from psychological safety. So inclusion and belonging and ethical behavior and mistakes, all of those things are made better because of psychological safety. And then in terms of how do you build that, I do think it is essential that the leaders in the organization and by that I mean in particular the people who are the C-suite, the highest ranked people, believe this matters because it's very hard for others to seed those ideas if the top ranked folks in the environment are not in support of it. But I also do believe that everybody has the ability to affect the culture of the place just by checking in on your colleague, noticing, gosh, you were quiet in staff meeting. Everything okay? I'm happy to grab lunch today if you need to talk. Or being upfront about their own mental health, right? So saying things like, went back into therapy this year. Thank goodness for that. I feel so much
Mhm.
better than I was a year ago. When you lead in that way, noisy self care, you make it possible for everybody else to engage in that kind of support. Just as an example, it is really helpful to say to somebody who is struggling, hey, did you know we have an EAP that provides free and confidential mental health counseling? Here's how you contact them. And I recommend you reach out. Very different to say we have an EAP. They provide free and confidential mental health counseling. Really helped me when I needed it. here's how to contact them, and I hope you reach out if you could use help. When we say that second thing, we make it possible for everybody else to do it. And that is true regardless of your role, your job title. So I think it is essential. You're going to have the biggest impact and change when the people who are in the C-suite or the highest ranked positions are leading with empathy. But I also believe it's everybody's responsibility.
No, I hear you. Look, I love what you say about we're all creators of the cultures, not just consumers, right? So that's number one. But then you've got positional power where you can set the tone and model the behaviors and hopefully open up spaces. I'm going to push you on this because this is a really tricky one in terms of practical tips for leaders that feel like, oh, they have to walk on eggshells these days. They never know what to say and what they should and shouldn't do. I remember in 2020, we had the pandemic, we had the murder of George Floyd. People needed spaces at work to discuss these issues and much more, whether it's mass shooting, like you said, Me Too. What advice would you give to leaders that are really worried now about whether they should go on record to say what they think about an issue or support a certain part of their community or their population? How should they tackle this practically? What options have they got?
Sure. A couple things. One, I think that it can be helpful to have a shorthand language that is common for your team, a vernacular that makes it easy for people to say, I'm having a hard time right now without having to go into the detail. Because some people might not be ready to talk about it. I have certainly cried at work. I don't know if you have ever cried at work. Yeah. But it's not comfortable. And I can imagine there are people who are like, I don't want to get into this right now because I'm afraid I'm going to cry and I don't want that. You don't ever want to push people to have to disclose something if they're not really ready to talk about it. Instead, have just an easy way that people can talk about what they're going through. Like, man, I'm at like 15% today. It's been a really hard day. Or I've seen a team where they did a weather report. It's just sunny skies all week for me. And somebody else can say, man, it started off sunny, but all of a sudden this storm came in yesterday and I've just been in torrential downpours ever since. Okay, great. I know that you need a little extra space, maybe a little extra grace. And as your supervisor or colleague, I might take you aside later and just check in and open the door if you want to talk about it. Again, you don't have to, but just create the space that you're allowed to talk about it if you want to. So I think making that just an easier thing to talk about in general on your team can be worthwhile. And then you asked in particular about what I think of as the elephant in the room issues. So George Floyd or the violence in Israel and Palestine or the election, any number of issues that people might be really anxious, concerned about, and not sure it's okay to talk about at work. Those are really challenging. And I know that for a lot of leaders, as you said, it's, I can't win. And I remember I did a training one time and a guy in the back of the room raised his hand and he said, so as the manager, isn't it my job to avoid the elephant in the room at all costs? Like, why on earth, if we know that is, something that people are going to be all fired up about, why on earth would I bring that in? But here's the thing, if it is on people's mind, it is already affecting your workplace, whether people are talking about it or not.
Right.
It's already affecting people's productivity, maybe their absenteeism, certainly affecting their sense of inclusion and belonging, their sense of, do I feel seen in this workplace? I have a friend who was a law firm partner and an African-American woman. And in the weeks after George Floyd was murdered, she said her firm said nothing. And she's watching all the other firms make statements. She's watching all their clients make statements. And they keep saying, we don't get political. We don't want to weigh in. And finally, after 3 weeks, they issued a statement. And she said, honestly, I'd already written my resignation letter. Because if you don't care when somebody who looks like me is murdered, what do you actually think of me? So I think as much as we want to say to ourselves, we can just stay above the fray or we don't have to get into everything. There are things where we need to say something. And in particular, those are issues where our values are at stake. And those will differ by organization. I don't know. There are some organizations like Patagonia, right? You know what Patagonia's issues are.
Yeah.
And so you understand, you expect that if there is an environmental disaster or something, you expect Patagonia to make a statement. For most organizations, a sense of inclusion and belonging is part of their values statement. So you can see the importance of making some sort of acknowledgement about that kind of issue. And then how to do it, there's the question of the internal discussion versus the external facing statement. My concern is always going to be much more on the internal discussion. I'm not a comms person, so I wouldn't ever say what people should be including in those statements, other than I think it's important to talk about your values and acknowledge the grief, the trauma that people may be experiencing. But in terms of the internal discussion, some organizations like to have large scale town hall meetings. Sometimes it's done instead in smaller groups, like managers are instructed to bring it up at a staff meeting. I think that the way that different organizations will handle that is important, that it be authentic to their culture and to their people. I've seen organizations where they say every Friday at 3 p.m. we have conference room. Anybody who wants to go in and process events of the week, that is a place that they can do it. I've seen teams where they have just a Slack channel where people can respond and dive in when they feel ready for it. So there are lots of ways to do it, but the key is making sure those 5 things we just talked about for a one-on-one conversation, those apply when you're talking to a group as well. So listen, acknowledge, make sure that everybody who speaks gets acknowledged. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I'm really grateful that you opened up here. I know this has been a hard time. Thank you for being brave enough to share all of that stuff. So acknowledge, share information. Is there anything that the organization is doing? Are there places people can go and volunteer? Those kinds of things. Empower with resources. I know this is a hard time. Remember, we have an EAP. And then return. This is the one where we always fall down.
Yeah.
I remember one friend said to me that she was in a staff meeting and somebody said, "Oh yeah, that Asian American hate thing, is that still going on?" And she was like, "No, all good, all good. It's all been
Trauma of the day has passed.
sorted."
Oh,
Yeah, so make sure that we go back later and check in.
right. And that's the thing, because as you said, those things are ever present. I play with this phrase called "not my monkey, not my circus." And I say play, I try to use it as a reverse brainstorm, like what should be my monkey? What should be my circus? And what monkey left unheard will turn into some very mischievous thing. But I think what I love about the work you do is you push through that. I said I push you because it's difficult. These are difficult questions that people are wrestling with. You've got employee activism, you've got boycotts. Businesses are really trying to figure out what to say and what to do. But I love that you're giving a framework for addressing those questions. You're not going to tell them what to say or what to do, but you are going to tell them to have principles behind their choices and their decision making. To your point, trauma-informed decision making. So that's beautiful. I really don't want to close us out, but I wanted to just remind you of the opening quote of your book and ask you why you chose that, what it means to you. You chose a quote from Henry David Thoreau. "Could a greater miracle take place than for us to take a look through each other's eye for an instant?"
Yeah, I do love that quote. And I love Thoreau in general. I think what particularly speaks to me about that quote is that we can't, right? As much as I know you and care about you and hear about your experience, I never get the privilege of actually understanding what it feels like to be you, the way that you view the world. But we can try. We can try to get better at it. That's why, to me, it would be a miracle if we really could. And so, to me, that's the thing that I'm always striving for. Please let me understand just a little bit better what it feels like for you.
So moving. Well, look, to our listeners, check out Katharine's book, available where all books are sold. It's a great resource. I'm just so grateful to you, Katharine, for trying, for finding ways to help us try to do these hard things well together. So really grateful to you for spending some time with us on the podcast. And we hope to see you back here again soon with more tips and tricks.
I would love it. Thank you. It has been a privilege, as always.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.